Hi, I'm Stassi and I'm a fashion design student at British High School of Art and Design in Moscow. A couple of weeks ago, a girl named Maria, a fashion design student in Copenhagen, reached out to me on Instagram. She was wondering about my work process in sketchbook in a bit more detail after watching my fashion designer sketchbook tour from semester 8 of a degree collection video, which you can have a look down below. I'm going to link it. She was wondering if I had any specific rules for working in sketchbook, layout-wise or composition-wise, and if our tutors taught us anything specific about the sketchbook work throughout the last 4 years that I've been studying in university. So I thought that this could be a pretty interesting video for someone who's looking out for things like this as well. And I am going to be showing you 9 of my oldest sketchbooks. Now I'm not going to be flipping through all of those because that would have been like a 10-hour long video. But today I'm going to be showing you a few pages from 9 of my oldest sketchbooks, which I think outline the work process the best and show you a little bit of evolution as well. I'm going to be starting with the oldest sketchbook and finishing with the newest that I'm working on right now. The oldest sketchbook I did 4 years ago, and they're going to be a little bit rough and shaky, but I think even the bad pages, so to speak, are still interesting and important for you to see the evolution process. I'm not going to be talking you through the projects themselves because that's a topic for another video, which I'm going to be filming once I graduate the university this year. I'm just going to be talking about the composition, color, texture, layout, and something like this. So the first thing I want to outline is that in my university practice, a sketchbook for a fashion design student is the most important part for the development of the collection and for you to express all your thoughts on a page. I hope it's going to be helpful for other fashion design students or for people in general who are interested in this topic. So yeah, let's get into it. We're going to start with my oldest sketchbook. It was the first one I ever started during my years in university. It's not the most exciting, and it's also not just fashion related sketchbook. During that year we had different directions of design we could explore. So here I just marked the page because I like the way it's composed, more or less. If I were to change anything, I would have made this a little bit small so that the outer frame would be somewhere where the inner frame is ending right now. In here I wanted just to show you how different blocks of color are interacting with each other. This side is the same as this side, just inverted. So all the white spaces that you see in here are colored in on that side of the page. And if you were to apply it to fashion design somehow, it would be interesting to see the division of pages. This is an A4, almost A3 sketchbook, and I like the way one page is more scattered around, but the whole page is covered with some kind of ornament, so to speak, and then the other page is mostly free but has a very structured frame for it and has more white space around it. So the next page would be this. This was one of our fine art projects on foundation, and here I wanted to just give an example of how you could have a lot of things on a page. Usually we are asked to reflect on everything we put inside of our sketchbook, and I like to put things which I've used during the project. So this was one of the color palette leftovers which I just squished on a page. I never like to throw away anything that I'm using, so I'm trying to use as much as I can. So in here I glued this in. The background was just for me to clean out my roller in between colors, so that was something I was interested in doing. We also glued in a weekly reflection, so if you were to stretch it out, it kind of has a nice division on the page. So you have larger elements as well as smaller elements. So if you were to break it down in sections, you have large page, which is this kind of a gradient of purplish going into white. Some print element, which would be this acetate paper, and then you have smaller elements such as this little rectangle, this big block of text, and larger note with kind of horizontal lines going all the way through. I am not sure if that's making much sense, but for me, I like to work usually in layers. I like things to be tactile, I like things to be flippable, so for me this is kind of a nice element so that you could have a look in the sketchbook for your own. In this page, I love the spread because again, it is interactive. You could flip it around, you can see what's going on inside, and it's quite big block. So if you were to look at it like this, all you could see is a division between white and black and a large spread with a little bit of an organic kind of graphic detail and some text. During the projects on foundation later on as well, we were giving each other a lot of notes, so I highly recommend you stick them into your sketchbook even if there's something negative. Negative notes are always the best because they give you some room for improvement, and reflect on them also as well. We were doing monoprinting, and that's a technique I definitely want to explore later on in the future. This was initially a piece we were not supposed to use in a sketchbook. It was something we were using as a tool to make monoprints. I just loved it and I wanted to glue it in because it also gives you a little bit of reflective material. That is also something I like to play around with, different textures of paper. This is a reflective acetate, this is newsprint paper, which I used as one of the outcomes for the project. Again, a continuation of that project. I just glued in all of our rollers, which I felt were kind of arranged in an interesting manner, and some of the outcomes from the project, which I didn't use as the final pieces in the project. I glued in another piece of acetate, and then this piece of acetate you saw on the previous page gave me this outcome when I just kind of pressed it on a piece of paper as the alternative way of mono printing, kind of the reversed way of mono. And I like the spread. I think if I were to make it now, I would have just gotten rid of those, because this gives me a very kind of almost a print inspired, almost a repeat print inspired page, because you can see kind of the way your eye is traveling. If you were to remove this and this would almost look like a pattern you could use later on somewhere as a print, and I feel like it's quite interesting. This is breaking in a little bit. If I were to remove this would still kind of have the repetition and some breakage, and I love the way those colors go together. Usually in a project I'm trying to use similar color palettes, even in what kind of pencil I'm using when I'm writing in a sketchbook, because that is not distracting from anything. It kind of is bringing everything together. And if I were to make this my project, I would extract a color palette from here as well, and I would not go a different direction. I would probably not add anything like bright neon orange in here, because that would not really convey to the mood of the project. And usually when you're working in sketchbook, you really want to keep the same mood throughout the work. This, because we were working on different projects simultaneously, and we were the whole course was structured that the first 6 months of the course we were trying different directions of design. This was the spread I made to divide the sketchbook between fine art project that we did before and 3D project that we are doing after this page. So sometimes in a fashion design project, maybe if your school allows you to work in the same sketchbook, it will be helpful for you to have some kind of division between the projects, obviously, and it could be interesting to have some kind of inspirational, moody spread, which would be a clear distinction between the previous project and the next project. This was another fine art project, and we had to take inspiration from a sculpture and recreate it in drawing. And what I like here again is similar to what I showed you in a previous page, that you have a block of something and smaller blocks on the right. I always recommend and I love to see the work process going from one to another. So in here it was kind of interesting to see every layer of that painting I was working on. Always when you're working, add some reflections. So in here it was logical for me to explain exactly what I did, if I outlined something, if I added something in. And in fashion work, usually if you are making some kind of garment, you could add process photos from every little step, and here you can have like a final piece. If I were to remake it, I would probably either keep it just like this or add some kind of border to this painting, because it would highlight the page a little bit more. This would have to be the largest sketchbook I've ever made. Look, it even broke on me, so I had to make an extra cover for it out of prints that I worked on during the project. And this is from the other 6 months of that foundation year, when we were already focusing on just solely fashion design work. Can I open one of the pages? Again, this is not the most beautiful spread I've ever made, and I wanted to show it to you because of the way it is spread out. So I used a couple of like leftover colors that I wanted to put on this page, and I wanted to explore movement. And if I remember correctly from that project, I was interested in dance and continuous movement, so I was looking into that artist, and I think it's interesting to see how those photos from the dancers are moving with the page on the background. If I were to change anything, I would probably consider writing it in a different way, because right now it is taking a lot of attention, and I feel like the blocks of color in the background with the photos are working quite well as opposed to the text on the background. So I think if I were to change it, I would try to write it in the same motion as this paint stroke is going, and consider to write this text in a little bit smaller manner so that it will not take too much attention from those photographs in the foreground. Now that we're done with my foundation sketchbooks, we can move on to level 4, so the first year of bachelor's degree actually working on fashion. This was the first project I was exploring. I think it was punk culture, and I wanted to show you this spread because I feel like the way it is moving throughout the page is quite interesting. I'm usually interested in either breaking the page into sections or actually throwing the movement throughout the page. So I was one of those people who have never even tried a spiralized sketchbook, because I love the middle point of the page of the spread, and I love working with it. So in here I like the amount of textural elements and the way that the squarish photos are cut off with me following the natural line of it. So I love the fact that I have a little recycled denim piece in here with some sharp elements, because it would be relevant to the actual punk research. Then a piece of fabric which I think I bought in a second-hand shop in Berlin when we went with our school during foundation year. And I have some tracing paper, some paper some leather. Because I was focusing on it being a punk aesthetic, I was not really worried about making everything clean and perfect, and so even little splatters here and there are fine for me, at least for this project. Your sketchbook mostly is for you to walk around with your thoughts, with everything, and reflect on things that you've researched, but some pages still need to be moody and just to help you work around with the project later on. So not every page has to be a reflection of something. It can be just a phrase or like a quote that can inspire you later on. So for me, this was the page that I just wanted to color black to give some mood to the project, and because I was looking into sort of crime scene aesthetic, I wanted to add that tape in here, be very messy, and just add a quote or like a sentence. In here I want to focus your attention to the right side of the page because I love the way everything is interacting with each other. So because I was changing the way my research is going, so I was not really looking to the punk aesthetic anymore, I wanted to see corsetry, as every fashion student I feel like in the world is exploring at some point. So I wanted to show how you reflect in photos. So I had this corsetry image which is kind of torn, imperfect, worn out, which goes with the aesthetic of my project as opposed to those perfect images on the left. I wanted to reflect on the photos, so I had leftover pieces of paper from I think our fashion illustration sessions, which I didn't throw away because I want to keep everything. I glued them in here, I taped them in here, and I redrew the same photo with very quick, very fast gestures, I think even with my non-dominant hand, so it was my left. The most important tip our tutors always tell us is that you reflect on the images with your hand drawing. It's most important because your hand usually goes a very different direction as opposed to a printer, or even if you trace something, it will give you some more natural or raw feelings. Maybe you kind of miss a line and that will be an inspiration for some kind of finishing or for a print later for yourself, for your collection. It's very important, so I suggest you also try that as well. I like how the line is interacting with different types of paper, with sellotape, and even though it's quite different from the mood of that left side of the page, it still makes sense within the whole collection, within the whole project. In here, even though it's not the most beautiful page ever, I still wanted to show you how you could reflect on your first-hand research. So usually when you research, when you make a project, you have primary and secondary research. I always mess up which one is which, but I think primary research is you take photos of your inspiration, your actual, so something that you have seen that's your own, so that not photos from the internet or not something from library. So the first hand would be a photo or a song or a vibe or anything you can think about. So those were my photos, my own photos, and this was a photo from that corsetry research which you saw on a previous page. So I wanted to reflect on them in a way that I could use later on for my sampling techniques. So in here, because I was looking into that metal wire mesh, it could be interesting to see how that could be translated. So I knit a little sample with leftover calico that I had. Then this were steps, and I felt like they were so interesting because they were imperfect. Some of the steps were still covered in metal like edging, and some of those were raw. So I thought that could be an interesting translation for sampling as for finishing. So some could be finished in bias binding perfectly, like as if those covered metal little steps, and then some could be raw like they are in here. And then in this one I saw exposed like brick, I think, and I like the way that it's speaking from within, so I showed this as well. And I have this corsetry right in here because I feel like it still is conveying a similar mood. So those kind of bust cups are similar to that stretched out metal, which is imperfectly kind of pushed out through that metal wire, and the edging and the finishing is the same bias binding. So even though I was not exactly sure how I could use it later on, it still gives a similar feel. So it's very important for you to combine your research and different points of view. Our tutor always says that you can't compartmentalize, so you can't keep your corsetry research to one page, your city around the time to the other page, and that, I don't know, crime scene aesthetic to the other page. You have to combine them all together, otherwise your project won't really make sense either to you or to the examiner who's going to be looking at it later on. So you will see naturally different connections evolving from those photos being together, because I don't think I would have made the same connection if that corsetry research was not on this page. So it's very important. It's a whole spread of different designs, of different quick manipulations I was thinking about, and some of those are just done in different lines. So I wanted to show you that when you're sketching, even if you don't like your design completely, you can just highlight a little section which you feel is the most successful in that little area and reflect on it. Always, a reflection is the most important part. For example, in here, I wasn't sure about the right side, but I definitely liked the way the sleeve was drooping, and I wrote that I wanted to have some kind of hidden message on the inside, even though I didn't exactly know what message that could be. Also, you have like a little zigzag stitching from the previous page when I was making like a little pouch for my design. designs to go into, and it is kind of correlating with the little details I was kind of sketching in here as well. So if you're interested, you can always stitch on the page. Your sewing machine is going to handle it quite fine, so don't worry about it. Always reflect, that's the most important part, because when you're going to be flipping through the sketchbook, when you get stuck a little bit from the project, which is completely normal, you're going to see all the favorite parts of yours right away. This page is like the opposite from that previous one. I took a bunch of photos of the process, which is also very important. Every little detail, every little manipulation you do on your stand, always take a photo of. And then I sketched over some of those details I felt were successful. I drew out little details I wanted to definitely see, and traced the little experiments as well to see how that will be looking flat. This was also a photo of the process, so it was kind of closer to the final thing, because we had sort of like a lineup. We asked models to wear stuff so that we could see how it performed with the body, how it works around it, and I also added little sections because the model was quite busty and my garment was not ready for a model to have such beautiful curves. I had to do some alterations to the way the design was fitting and make some changes, because on the body your garment always looked quite different. So another tip for not really sketchbook process but the design process in general, always try your things on the live model, because it is going to look very different, especially when the garment works with the movement of the body. It's going to look interesting. Even then you can take a lot of photos or a video and then do a bunch of screenshots and see how it looks in 3D and in 360 degrees in movement, because it might inspire you to do something else entirely later on as well. This was our denim project also on first year of bachelor's degree, and it's probably the smallest sketchbook I've ever had so far. Because we were working with denim, we had a bunch of different samples and we were working on a completely new sewing machine, so I felt like I wanted to add different photos of how that sewing machine in the foot looked like for me for future reference, even though I don't think I'll ever forget how that looks. But there's a little bit of stitching and experimentation as opposed to regular sewing machine to show how the machine actually works, and a little denim sample and a little sketch of everything. But what I wanted to show you in here are the samples. So usually we show a sample book or like a collection of samples once we finish the project, but because I had multiple of those, I just felt like I wanted to add some to the actual project so that I would always remember what kind of denim I have, how it frays, what type of finishing it is, if it works around folding in multiple layers, and how the stitching looks on it with a regular sewing machine. With this we were exploring a interesting technique of drawing different sections of denim trousers and playing around with them on the body, scaling them up, scaling them down. So I feel like that was kind of an interesting experiment, but what I wanted to show you here is an array of photos in horizontal direction with a little bit of a background photo, which is actually a piece of that experiment which I just taped in. I love the interaction of it, I love the direction of that movement of the background, so it's always kind of an interesting background with the photos. So this page, I like how it was flowing. I was researching hacked a film about war, so it was quite a lot of distress, a lot of raw things. I was interested in sketching out this little detail because I wanted to see the little strap details, everything that the person, the medic, would carry around, and I just added the same colour choices as in the poster of that movie I was watching too. I like the way it is spread out because it is giving a lot of horizontal lines and the text is flowing in the same direction. I think this part would be a little bit better if I also kind of prolonged it, because your eye would be traveling kind of horizontally across the page. That would be the only thing I would change in here. But generally I like how raw and very quick those sketches were. This is kind of similar to that previous page on the white shirt project I was showing you, so just a lot of different quick sketches. I think it would benefit if one of the sides, for example this, would be kind of bordered with dark paint, so I think it would kind of give a little bit more visual interest to the spread in general. So I would kind of take quite a thick brush with dark blue colour and just kind of draw paint around all the white spaces on that side of the... In here, again, exactly the same photo with different reflections, with different quick manipulations on with a pen, and I think that's the most helpful for me usually when I'm designing. So you can always extend, go beyond the actual photo, so leave a little bit of empty spaces in between the photos so that you could explore this idea as well. Otherwise, if you tighten them all together, if you have them side by side, you won't have any room for extending throughout the page for going outside the actual photo, so leave a little bit of space and always reflect on what you've done. This is the last sketchbook from my first year of bachelor's degree. This page I love because there's a lot of information happening, a lot of print, a lot of detailing, and I love how layered it is. So this page acts as a mood board, a lot of inspiration, everything I was looking on in the beginning stages of the process, project research. So I have little blocks of papers, I have different materials, so a little bit of like the trimming, the alternative side of the trimming as well. I love looking into the wrong side of the thing, so because those little trimming details that have frayed edges. I felt like the wrong of that trimming was even more interesting than the actual right side. I have masking tapes all around, a lot of different notes that I was looking into. Right from the start, from the beginning, from my first mood board of the project, I was reflecting on how I could actually later on use it. So even those little trimmings, the edges of that stamp are kind of reflecting in the same finishing, the trimming detail from Estonian national costume I was looking into. So I think the crazy amount of things that are happening is balanced out by the amount of different types of paper that is in the background or in the foreground, and the way that everything is mostly kind of vertical because of those trimmings. So the photos are, even though this is quite squarish, all the rest are quite vertical and your eye is moving upwards and across the page. So I think that's quite a successful page all around. This is one of my old design processes. I used to collage a lot on top of the body, but again I think this is quite successful because it mostly goes vertically and all of the notes and reflections are written also vertically most of the time. Because this design is kind of moving horizontal on the bottom part, the note is also horizontal, so I think usually the page is quite simple and white, no background, no paint, no drawing in the background, because the collages are quite dynamic and heavy visually themselves. I'm kind of contradicting myself with this spread because on the trouser project that I was showing you before, I said that you should have a little bit of space between the photos when you're reflecting on them and kind of sketching on top, and I think that was something that held me back from actually exploring a different potential bottom option, because later on in the project I changed the bottom completely and I made it like a 2-meter long train in the end. So I think again in here, layout wise, I love everything about it, but the design reflection wise, I think it will be more beneficial for me to have 2 spreads just like this and just have 4 photos on the whole spread, like with giant spaces in between them. Because I was exploring the bottom option, it would be more helpful for me for sure. This was my first project of level 5, so second year of bachelor's degree, and I did a photo full screen and added it on top of the sketchbook cover. This page I wanted to show you because of the play around with textures. I was interested in looking to The Invisible Man, a book by Ralph Ellison, and here I feel that this was kind of reminiscent of the idea itself. That was kind of one of the first mood boards, so I like it because there's a lot of hand drawing, different medias, different types of paper, a little bit of a textile sample, which is always quite nice because I was thinking of using this color and this texture. Again, this is quite lovely because the first thing I did was sketch out this little detail for different reference points, because this was a jacket project, and I love how it is the background, the papers that I added to the background are following the same line, so it is kind of giving you a feel of dynamism. Text is also horizontal and I like it because the flow is not being broken, it all kind of going swiftly, and if it was to be broken into columns it would reflect the same idea as it is on those photos, but when you look at them the eye is traveling vertically just until this point, because the photos are becoming smaller and the eye is going kind of horizontal at this point. So I think this was the best choice for me to go horizontal as well. I've also highlighted a couple of people that I wanted to research later on in the project, and I think that's also very important when you're adding bits of text which you've just printed from the internet. Always reflect and highlight things you want to research later on so that you don't have to read the whole text later in the project when you're kind of stuck in between the things that you're thinking about. So this page also is kind of a continuation of that previous page. I love how messy it is. I think with this project it was the first time I kind of found the flow, how I like to work with kind of splatters and different sketches, quick responses, some photos with reflections in illustrations right away. So I think also if you find a way you like to work in, also explore it. It was kind of a rough, very quick, dirty-ish way of working, but I love that the photos are not square most of the time. I love to outline them with a little bit of a border, with a dark background, so also exploring backgrounds and seeing how it works with the process is very important. I like this side of the page a bit more because the image that I kind of sketched out is not reflective of any of those I have in here, but with this side I think it's amazing that the scale is also similar, but I changed a little bit the ways that I wanted to work with. So I was interested in the shoulder part, so I've kind of extended it very much. So when you're reflecting in the photos, they don't necessarily have to be the same as an illustration of that photo, but rather extending or scaling up, scaling down some little details that you're interested in exploring later on. Because I like playing with textures and I like some things be a little bit three-dimensional, I kind of started working with writing my notes and things I wanted to research or focus on during the project on fabric. It adds a little bit of visual interest, it is a little bit three-dimensional, and because the project was kind of scattered and raw and unfinished, it kind of adds a little bit of that moody effect to a very boring and simple page as well. Because we're exploring different color manipulations as the technical side of the project, I just added this color as a background background and photos of that development in here as well. I wrote down the numbers and gave some reflection to that process as well, and had a photo of that flat color. I like that the background is kind of dynamic and going different ways, and the front and those photos are kind of squarish, and the actual thing that is inside of that photos is reflective of that dynamic and organic background. In here I wanted to show you again that I inserted some photos of the samples because I didn't want to put them in the project in the sketchbook, because I had them as a sample book separately. It is great to collage them to see how they would look on the body. It's not something I did on this page, but usually it is something I like to do, is playing around with the samples on the other side of where I was initially intending for them to be. So this would be a pocket, and that would typically be on a jacket somewhere near the hips, but I was playing around with them on the body in different ways. This was a template of an outline I was trying to follow to make this finishing, and even though it didn't work, I kind of inserted it in here as a texture reference for the samples that I was working on. Here I was quite close to finishing the actual design, so I was just working around figuring out what the color could be. So I highlighted in different ways, working around with the pattern, figuring out how I could work around with finishings and different fabrics as well. And that's because I have a lot of different sketching in here. It was logical for me to put some photos on the other side of the process, actually how it was evolving, and of the stage of that toile that I had at that point. And here, when I was almost done with the actual design and I kind of looked like in the end, I sketched a little final piece sketch in here, and I separated it in different letters so that I could write out exactly how it is constructed if I were to ever recreate it again. And with this spread, I like that this is illustrated on one side. The letters are highlighted with a similar pen that is in here, so that your eye is kind of drawn not to the actual sketch, rather to the divisions of the sections, so that you could read it, and that this fabric is in here as well as the title of what I should be working on in here. This was my second sketchbook for the H&M collaboration project that we did on second year of BA, which I have a video to. Because we were focusing on styling on the sketchbook, I already had my garment finished, so I made a little sketch of that garment, and I was thinking of making different styling details. So I was thinking of creating boots, and I added a little strip of old leather belts so that I could make the sort of snow boots with the nails or something. And the material I used in here to think about the oxygen mask I was recreating also is relevant to the color choice in the actual sketch in the final thing. The sellotape is yellow as the actual final design, and all the writing that I did in here is also in a similar color scheme. Because there's a lot happening and a lot of different colors and a lot of information on photos and sketches I have, I did not want to make any background, so it was white. And because this is a recycled book with white paint all over it, you can still see a little bit of text speaking through the pages, so there was no point in making the background any more dynamic than it is already. I wanted to create like a mountain of white fabric as if she's lying in the snow, and I think this idea would have been conveyed a bit better if those two photos weren't here, so it would actually look like a mountain and a pile of clothes and a pile of people lying in that mountain. So I could have just integrated those two photos in the mountain itself. This was the last project of second year of my bachelor's degree. And here you can see that even though I'm usually keen on putting a lot of information on the page, I felt like this could be quite blank, left clean, as if it's a gallery space, because I was taking photos as a reference of a photographer, and I wanted it to be clean because the background of those photos is white and it's quite simple, so it looks kind of cohesive within the whole thing. And again, this is a recycled book, so you can still see a little bit of text speaking through the white paint that I covered it in, and I have a tiny little bit of text explaining what this actually is, because you always have to reference the photos that you add in your sketchbook. And because I was looking at soft shapes and the way it moves with the body, the way gravity works on it, I wanted to add a little bit edging, which would be kind of soft as well, and I added a little bit of kind of crumbled up jersey because it is kind of reminiscent of the whole thing. And I feel like, again, your eye is kind of moving this way in a very soft, smooth form, even though the photos are quite squarish. And because it was a jersey project, I added a little bit of potential jersey I wanted to use, and also referencing all the artists I was taking inspiration from. And here, because I was looking into textures and I wanted your eye to be drawn to that photo sequence that I have in here, those were screenshots of my mom. We were talking with her, and then I loved the way her top was drooping, and I added a little bit of texture that I could potentially use in here as well, with that masking tape, with a paper that I have underneath. I think it would look a bit better if I had something like a repeated version of that top that I have my mom wearing, if I just sketched it out kind of very gently, very quickly. So it could look interesting if I added a little bit of watercolor shading to it, but right now it is still conveying the idea of texture, a photo, interrupted photo with some references, some notes for potential use, textures, and everything else. In here it's a completely different feel to the previous page, but it still conveys the idea, and I was looking into, again, repeating a block of color, quite dark, some interruptions, some lines, referencing the actual lines from the photos, and a little bit of texture, and a block, again, quite squarish, quite simple, a repeat of the same page layout. And on the other side, a lot of photos, a lot of notes, again, taking from it, a little bit of extension of the photo. In here I'm again exploring overlays, and even though those photos of explorations where I was sketching on top of the photos are vertical, vertical and separated quite strategically. I like the way it's kind of overflowing to the other side, even though they are interrupted. And when I'm usually overlaying, I don't want it to be lined up to the actual photo that's underneath, because it kind of breaks it down into very strategic lines. And I want to, if I'm making overlay, I want it to overlay horizontally and vertically as well, so those lines are kind of overlaying everything all together. It's quite helpful for me to explore different finishing ideas which I'm trying to introduce into the project and have them right in the sketchbook. So I tried different finishings on the jersey machine, and I drew the ways I could work around them as well. And in here, I love the fact that this page is mostly black and white, but the only color sketch that I have in here is also reflected in the sampling that I've added in here. That was kind of an offcut from the sleeve that I was working around with, and those were again sketched and kind of written around different notes here and there, so I wanted it to be cohesive. Well, it's not really about the flow, but still the way the lines are going and everything, your eye is also drawn kind of horizontally and it is moving throughout the page. Then the last page of that sketchbook would be a fashion illustration session. When we were working on the fashion illustration, I was keeping my project in mind, so I was just using the same colors that I wanted to use in the project so I could glue this in. So I glued in some leftover masking tape from that fashion illustration session and that leftover paper in the background as well. And I love how the tape is going in different directions, providing some visual interest and 3D effect, and is correlating with those blue pen lines on the background as well, because they're going multiple different directions. In general, when you're sketching a sketchbook, try to provide some visual interest within the line you're working on. Even though I'm the biggest fan of mixed media, you don't have to be, and if you prefer to work just with a pencil, you can just also do different thicknesses of lines, different pressure points, and different kind of feeling of the line as well. It can be gentle, it can be rough, it can be straight, and very, very thick and thin in different areas. It's going to give you a bit more dimension even in just a pencil sketch. But if you choose to go mixed media, you can always play around with the things and get the most of that material. So if you want to do a thin line, there's no point in using a crayon or an oil-based pastel, because it's not going to be performing the same way as a pencil, for example, or a sharp pen. Now we're on to my last sketchbook. So this is my degree collection second sketchbook. The first one you can have a look, link down below as a video on my channel, and you can actually analyze it for yourself from all the points that I was just talking you through. Because of the previous 4 years of experience, everything kind of comes naturally to me, but the 3 things that I focus on right now are color, texture, and text. So color wise, this sketchbook will not see any green in any little detail, any highlight ever, because it doesn't exist in my color palette. Second, texture, and I mostly prefer to have some texture in every page in my sketchbook, which you'll see a bit when I film this sketchbook tour when I graduate. And then text wise, because my handwriting is naturally quite frilly and it looks a bit more like a heart rate monitor rather than a crisp horizontal line, I choose to focus on just capital letters, and usually I prefer to reflect on different little photos that I have in here. So I try to make this crumpled sample, and just right now I crumpled the edge of this photo of this page because I felt like it would be a reference to this. So far this is my absolutely favorite page because everything is so cohesive. I love it so much. But if I were to analyze it, this is one of the designs I had in my project. I love the way every text, every little detail I was outlining in here is kind of drawing your eyes to this design, obviously because of the lines, but also the way it is positioned. It's not attracting too much attention text, and it's rather drawing your eye to the actual thing. So I love how I have the print that I used and explored in this design. I have a little bit of layered off-cut pieces of fabric that I was also exploring for this project, for this particular design. I have some writing and the reflective, have a little bit of textural element from the leather I was thinking of using, and the color choice is also correlating within everything. I also love how there's little bits of text in that actual print, and I've added it here also to this little detail. I also love outlining masking tape recently, so I'm doing it quite often. And look, if I were to glue this page down, it would look so flat, the whole page would look flat. But now that I'm analyzing all the sketchbooks so far with you guys, I'm noticing that I have a kind of a way of working. So I like to have a large block of something darker, either a print or a shade or just painting the page, and then lots of little bits of elements of different shapes and sizes. So if I were to change anything about the page, I would have just maybe moved this masking tape a little bit to the bottom, and this masking tape again like maybe 1 centimeter, so those leather strips would also move down, but still have enough of white space, because this border is kind of moving your eye towards the center of the page and like moving around here. So I love the page so much. This page is full of different textile samples and a couple of photos of me exploring a different leather jacket option. But why I love a page is because it is so crammed with different textural elements, different color options as well. It is kind of broken into sections in a way, so it is scattered and quite the different direction than I usually take, but color wise it's quite cohesive, and I love the amount of textural elements. And this is like a fuck up that I accidentally did when I was testing the denim machine with heavy stitching, and it didn't really work, but I feel like it could be such an interesting element for me to introduce into collection if only I had more space for new textures and new elements. Writing in here is kind of correlating with the shape of that little sample. If I were to change anything, I think I would have maybe added a background page to this one of some sort of beigey grey beigey color, because it would kind of draw a bit of attention to that section a little bit more. But other than that, I'm quite happy and pleased with this. This is an option of, again, dividing your page into multiple sides and having a bunch of different informational elements on one side and a block of something on the other. I kind of framed it in here, but I think this background would have been better if it were to be left white, because this wouldn't draw as much attention to this side, because this side is also very dark and there's a lot of smaller elements. So I think this would have been better just white. In here, again, the same idea of a bunch of horizontal elements with a little bit of a vertical stroke coming in here. I think it's quite interesting because all the reflection is happening on the side and it's kind of leaving this vertical line for it to be replicated on this side as well as the text. Here is just the horizontal throughout the page, a bit of reflection and information on the other sides, but I think lately I've been quite into having it quite straight and simple all throughout the page. And this is the last page I'm going to be showing you. Something that is very beneficial when you're working across a collection is having a tiny little bits of fabric or like inspirational finishing details to be added underneath or somewhere closer to the actual sketches, so that when you're looking through it you can see how different things are correlating with each other, working with each other. I'm also adding a bunch of different notes because my collection, the range plan, is changing all the time. This was another tutorial record and I think it would have been better if I wrote in caps lock, again capital letters, because it is looking a bit too frilly, which is kind of the opposite of this cardboard vibe. So if I were to change, I would have written in caps lock. But something I like to do is also hide little notes and different reflections on the details underneath the floppy parts, because in here, if I were to write something on the other side, it would have been too much attention drawn to the illustrated pieces rather than the actual range plan, which I'm kind of showcasing in this page in general. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it was helpful for you. If you're a fashion design student or not, consider subscribing, and if you have any questions you can always write them in the comment section down below or in my direct messages on Instagram. I'm always happy to answer, because I feel like we should support each other and help each other as much as we can. So thank you, Maria, for inspiring this video, and thank you for watching, everyone. Bye!